I really enjoyed reading the sort of part of the book which looks at death, dependency and loneliness. It really resonates with my own experience of, working in care homes with older people living with dementia. I was really struck about the experience of Mrs. C, who I think becomes quite attacking of the staff team that are sort of tasked with her care. Can you tell me something about your work there? Because my understanding is you've gone in as a consultant to sort of try and unpack some of the difficulties that were arising.
Yes, well, in fact, I didn't see Mrs. C. Mrs. C was a resident of a nursing home for older people, and she'd been there quite a while. The problem was that Mrs. C had become very verbally abusive of the staff and other patients, really. The staff were very upset about it, really, and they asked me if I would see her. She refused. So then I said I'd go along and talk to the staff as a group to see if we could think about it. And perhaps then Mrs. C might see me, we wouldn't know. But they were happy to do that, so then I met with them as a small group of staff, the main carers for her, and talked about what had happened. It seemed, as I say, that they were suffering a great deal, that she'd been, up until fairly recently, she'd been fairly helpful and cooperative with everybody and pleasant. Now, what emerged was that she actually got close to somebody, to one of the carers, very close, and that carer had left. They didn't immediately appreciate just the impact that that leaving had. It had a lot of impact on her, because Mrs. C herself had been a carer actually in a nursing home previously, and then she'd become ill and needed to have care herself.
So terribly difficult, one might imagine, to then become the cared for.
Absolutely. But moreover, she'd been a carer since being a little girl, really, because her mother wasn't well. There was a large family. She was one of the oldest, and so she ended up looking after her siblings, really, in a rather premature and precocious kind of way, really. Unfortunately, it wasn't much of a childhood there, it seems, from what I could gather. So, and then that's what she'd done as a career. So she'd kind of held herself together in the caring role, as many of us do in some ways, putting our needs in some respects, or attending to needs in others instead of our own. But it meant there was a sort of neglect for her in that kind of way. So when she had suffered this loss, this more recent loss, it echoed actually in her life, because it wasn't a happy life, with many other losses, really. And this was expressed, really, by, again, it's a form of projective identification. She made this, in a sense, the staff felt that they were beyond useless. They were even worse than that. They were beneath her contempt, actually.
So they felt quite helpless.
Well, they felt helpless, but also, not just helpless, but their worst feelings about themselves, really.
Yes.
They'd come in to care for older people and so forth and so on. That was their reason for being there. But they felt, as I say, beneath her contempt, as though they were rubbish, actually. I mean, so they put it like that, really. And you might imagine staff in those sort of caring roles in nursing, very underpaid and very underappreciated generally. Of course, they're very vulnerable to feeling that way about themselves anyway.
Well, I mean, society's projecting that into them also, in a sense.
But you see, they were readily available as recipients for these feelings to be evoked in them. There was a sort of vulnerability, really, which she was unconsciously tapping into. So it made them, they just felt absolutely ghastly. And again, she wouldn't just abuse them and criticize them for no reason. She'd pick up. You see, there'd be elements, some elements, tiny grains of truth, as I mentioned before, which were then woven into her abuse. Plus the fact, of course, that some of the different races, all of these things would be used again, not necessarily consciously, but as a way of really evoking their worst possible feelings, which of course many of them had suffered in society anyway, and as you say, by having to take up this very kind of role which was so underappreciated in our society. But of course, what I was able to try and help them understand a bit more was that this was a clue to how Mrs. C herself was feeling about herself. Once again, she'd been dropped, really.
Yes.
And you see, when children very often aren't looked after and so on, of course, their immediate response, their immediate understanding is it's them. They must be a horrible child for mummy not to want them, or mummy to be not looking after them, or whatever. However, whatever, they're suffering in different ways.
You know, it certainly reminds me of some of the observations I've done of older people in care homes, and you know what you're describing there is how the staff are experiencing something of a sense of their own failings that, you know, links up with Mrs. C's fear of failing because she's becoming more dependent, perhaps.
You see, one of the interesting things they said about her was that she insists now on being in a wheelchair. There's no need for her to be in a wheelchair. She's perfectly capable. And, she holds on to the side of the wheelchair as if she's going to fall out of it.
Yes.
And you see, that's very interesting because Esther Baker talked about experiences of not being held, for whatever reason, the mother not being present enough, or just the experience of the baby or the child not actually being held physically or mentally in mother's mind long enough, was that it opens the infant or the child up to catastrophic anxieties, feelings of falling to pieces, falling into space. And some of the people who did baby observations on which this study was based, this insight, they said it reminded them of astronauts, falling through space. The babies where they wave around with their arms and legs and so on. So it caught that. It caught that terrific sense of just dissolving into space.
Yes, desperate sort of fear of fragmentation and all of that. And I mean, it's interesting, this idea of holding on, the sort of embodied communication of feeling dependent on the wheelchair, but psychically, in a way, attacking that dependency need or attacking the care that could have allowed for her to experience some kind of comfort in dependency. So there's a kind of tension in there.
Well, it does link with the omnipotence of this kind of superego, really. It is an omnipotent force in the mind, really, that intolerant of any vulnerability, intolerant of dependency. It also links up with what we talked about, envy, earlier on. Because envy hates dependency, hates recognizing that somebody has something that you need. And it can then be very spoiling and attacking of it. So it colours that well. I'm not suggesting that it's always envy, but it's certainly the omnipotence in that sort of destructive superego is a source of strength, of course, if you're feeling most helpless and most vulnerable. In a sense, it's there. It is. It's omnipotent. It knows everything, and it's that kind of absolute invulnerability, really. That's very appealing when you're most frightened and when you're most scared.
Yes.
You see, what was important was that Mrs. C's behaviour didn't necessarily get any better, but if the staff could understand it, it made it bearable. You see, if they could actually reach that ways, but actually I think things did soften, but once they had a bit more of an understanding of it, so it works both ways, but it may not have, you see, and the point is that it at least makes it bearable. If you're having to tolerate these things 8 or 12 hours a day, it's a lot to bear.
Yes, the emotional labour's intense. You remind me of Bion and containing the container, organisational containers and how they're, it's difficult to come by. When I was interrogating national policy as part of a bit of research I was doing, and there was a sort of endless repetition mantra of sort of maintaining independence. You know, so even within policy, this idea of having any sort of respect for dependency needs, particularly in dementia or towards the end of life, is very much pushed out, even, you know, within policy. So there's something about this that's going on at various levels, you know, internally in the individual, but more widely and broadly. You know, it's as if we're very, very sceptical or worried about dependency in perhaps these rather individualistic climes that we're in.
Well, you're absolutely right, and this is something that I do talk about in the book too, because you see, there's a concept called destructive narcissism, which actually is very much captures this, where it's this sort of whole hatred of vulnerability, really. That it's again another way of thinking about, I think, a destructive superego, really. But we see it really in the hatred of vulnerability expressed in the whole caring system, which is constantly being sabotaged and eroded in one way or another, and the intolerance really that people might need long-term help. And we're no longer, I have to say, no longer providing for that adequately.
I mean, Mrs. C is a really good example, Paul, I think, of how that sort of capacity, you know, sort of psychodynamic reflection seems to be so vitally important, you know, for staff teams working in institutions for people who are in need of long-term support. But I'm aware also of, you know, another chapter where you go into an institution and work with people who are, you know, enduring real sort of distress, emotional difficulty close to psychosis, and perhaps we can speak about that next.